the electricity grid or in others. So that was a very simple world. That world has changed. So we're going to talk about this some more. I personally come not from an engineering background, so I'm an economist. So I have more this like policy view on things. But of course, through the years, I mean, you try to understand what you're actually talking about. And of course, one challenge is that a lot of people who make the decisions in politics don't understand enough about it. So this is also an issue that we encounter both in Europe and also, of course, here too, that there is a lack of understanding of what's actually the challenges and what are actually the solutions. So, but that's just for starters. And we can go into more detail what this means in the current crisis of the war in Ukraine.
Brian, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Brian Sievers. My wife, business partner, mother of my children, grandmother of my grandchildren. 41 years now we've been married. We own and operate an anaerobic digester on our farm in eastern Iowa. It's operational now for 9 years. We process beef cattle manure, as well as a number of industrial food waste streams through our digesters. We just started into a new partnership on January 1st with Raceline Alternative Energy. And as we look down the road, our digesters, as they produce biogas up to this point, has been going into a CHP, and we've been generating electricity and selling that to Alliant Energy for 9 years. What we're going to do down the road is convert that plant over to an RNG plant, hopefully by November of this year, inject that into a pipeline. And that's all good and great. That helps pay the bills when you sell that molecule to a buyer in that pipeline or on that electricity grid. But what I value most in our project and on our farm is the material that comes out of the bottom of that digester each and every day. So we pump in about 60,000 gallons of manure and other co-feeds into our digesters every day, which means we pull out 60,000 gallons of fertilizer every day for our farming operation. We stockpile that or put it in a lagoon and use that then to fertilize. Actually, it's about 3,000 acres of crops every year. Our savings on that annually is probably conservatively $100 an acre. So we're saving $300,000 a year in fertilizer costs because we produce our own fertilizer. We don't purchase synthetic fertilizer. So therefore, our operation, when you look at the carbon intensity in that model, is much more carbon negative than probably my adjoining neighbors and farmers. That's what we value. That circular approach to agriculture production is going to be front and center as a new model in agriculture, I believe, here in the next 5 years. We've been working on a linear model for generations, and we've been promoting a more circular approach to agriculture production. And I think the time is now. When we're looking at anhydrous ammonia prices, if I were to go out and purchase those between $1,500 a ton and $2,000 a ton, and just a couple of years ago it was $300 a ton, that's a real pinch for farmers. So we have no way to pass that on. The only way we'll be able to make that profitable this year is it just so happens that corn is very expensive because of the whole Ukrainian-Russian conflict. So because of those high fertilizer prices, there is now the opportunity to capitalize on that margin in what we're producing on that natural fertilizer from our anaerobic digesters. And folks, we need to hit it hard now with our industry and growth. I mean, we've gone through some unprecedented growth here in the last 5 years. I don't think you've seen anything yet. If we focus on fertilizer and RNG, LNG going forward, it's my belief that we can transition agriculture production in the United States from a linear to a circular model probably over the next 10 to 15 years, very quickly. I mean, it took us generations to put the moldboard plow away, and rarely moldboard plows anymore. In fact, I only have a moldboard plow just because I can show my grandchildren what it looks like and what turned that prairie. And here's why I think it's so valuable as to what we do with our farming operation and that circular approach and being able to produce our own fertilizers. When my ancestors started farming in the prairie soils of eastern Iowa, the organic matter content was in the range of 8 to 10%. Our topsoil is probably 4 to 6 feet of topsoil. We've got about 12 to 18 inches of topsoil left. due to erosion primarily. That's going to stop, and we've done a number of practices to stop that erosion on our farms by adopting no-till, cover crops, and other practices, waterways, filter strips, the list goes on. And so we've managed to stop the erosion and the loss of topsoil. But what we hadn't solved is also the reduction in organic matter content. The organic matter content in our soils in the mid 1850s was in the 8 to 10% range. They're now at 3.5%. That's the problem. By using our digestate and the products out of our digesters, we are now starting to see that organic matter content go from 3.5% to the low 5% range in about 5 to 7 years' time. That's almost impossible to do. And fortunately, through the good graces of God, we've been able to find a technology that now allows us to utilize the products of that process, anaerobic digestion, to help restore the health of our soil. That's why I'm here today, is to explain that process and how what we're doing really is the best model to help ensure that we can produce our own food domestically, produce our own fertilizers domestically, produce our own fuels domestically, and anaerobic digestion on our farming operation sits right in the center of that circular process. So thank you.
Brian, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Brian McCarthy. It's nice to meet you all. I'm one of the co-founders of Archaea Energy. We're a publicly traded landfill gas to renewable natural gas company trading on the New York Stock Exchange. We, my partners and I bought a landfill in Pittsburgh 5 years ago, and that's how we got into the space. And we self-developed our own RNG plant at our site. And then we decided to take that on the road and to be landfill owners helping other landfill owners. And so the why of Archaea came about because, one, landfills create a lot of emissions. And so from a global story, Archaea is trying to solve that. By taking out all the landfill gas from the atmosphere, it's like taking 75% of cars off the road. So methane is the problem, and that's what we're trying to solve. But especially at the local level, if you think about folks that live directly near landfills and you think about flaring or hydrogen sulfide going to a flare, air quality is poor around landfills. And so from a social and economic justice angle, when you take landfill gas and you use it as renewable natural gas, you're wildly improving the public health for folks that live around landfills. And so how do we do that is, as landfill owners helping other landfill owners, we've gone out, we've tried to get as much of the gas processing expertise as we can to bring that in-house. And then finally, in order to make sure if we're truly going to be sustainable, we can't build a project and then within 18 months have that project fail. We have to say, if we're going to have gas rights here for 20, 30, 40 years, our project needs to succeed. And so we went out to really build and to mature the long-term fixed price market. So selling RNG to folks that need to decarbonize what they're doing on a scope 1 basis, where it's very difficult to do from a methane perspective. So natural gas is very hard to substitute for. Electricity is much easier. There's many different ways to do it. But if you're using methane, it's very hard to get away. It's such a beautiful fuel. But when you look at what a landfill does, when you have that waste that's already in place, even if we diverted all organics, we're going to have landfill gas for another 20 or 30 years. So we have this really great opportunity to improve the lives of people, for the next 3 decades, just assuming the status quo of where we're at. And then as we think about folks that want to decarbonize what they're doing, they get to participate in the good that we're doing at our projects. And so we started that out. We're helping universities decarbonize, utilities decarbonize, but as part of the commercial team and thinking about what's next, we're always looking at where is methane being used that also could be decarbonized. And that's where LNG comes in, and that's where the opportunity to take renewable natural gas from the United States and make it a global product, whether it's green ammonia, biomethanol, or eventually into renewable LNG that can then create this infrastructure between the United States and our allies that might need energy and be able to point to and say, this energy that the United States is providing, not only is it, we need it today, but it's also renewable. And so Archaea is trying to say, how do we continue to take what is being used for methane and try to decarbonize all of those things? And to do that, we have the gas rights for 88 landfills right now, and we're currently working to build that out. So by the time we get to about 2027 or so, we'll move from about 11 million MMBTU of production today to over 50 million MMBTU. And that's our goal, is to grow and then to continue to connect the good at our sites to basically the global audience that's looking to decarbonize.
And that's a great place for us to start this discussion about where we currently are, right? The situation in Europe was challenging before the Ukraine crisis began. And, Max has been there in the middle of it. And so, we talked earlier about how the shale gas revolution here, 2013, 2014, really changed the entire energy infrastructure and landscape and made us energy independent in a sense. So, there are things out there like that that could happen. But, it seems that Europe, in a sense, has backed themselves into a corner where now they're almost reliant on natural gas more than anything else. And, so let's start the conversation there and say where we are in a high level in that current environment that sets the table for us to do these specific things that we're talking about, with individual companies playing a role and LNG and RNG playing a role.
Yeah, thank you. So Europe overall imports, I mean, when I say Europe, I mean the EU, because of course Europe is more than that, and Norway is Europe, but not EU, and they don't import oil or gas, obviously. But the EU imports a lot of the fossil fuels for oil products is over 90%, 96%. For natural gas, it's over 80% import dependency. And of course, it's not all from weak partners. If you're very polite, you can call Russia maybe strategically a weakness to import from them. But it's of the imports, it's changes, of course, from year to year, but it's about 40 to 50% on average. But of course, the problem is their hardest because as the US is 50 states, Europe is now 27 member states. So some rely up to 100% on Russian gas. And of course, that's also not a big deal if gas is not a big deal in your energy mix, right? So if you depend on 100% Russian gas, but you use it maybe in one fertilizer plant or so okay, big deal. But of course, if that's your heat source for the winter, or if that's the backbone of your electricity grid, that's where it becomes a strategic weakness. And so that's what we have currently. So right now, it's not a drama because it's not the high heat season. We're through that, but people are really worried about the winter. What's happening in the winter? There's a mandate to fill up storage for the winter. It's the first time there's a European mandate for that. And of course, there's a problem. Not everybody has storage capacity, so they need to share this. So in the end, a lot of this comes down to solidarity or not. And the same thing, we talked about purchases before. So the EU also wants a joint purchasing approach. So that's the other side of it. They don't want every member state to run individually, because what happens if everybody scrambles to buy? We see that on Black Friday here. That's then you drive up, it's a rush, and that's not good, right? You drive it.
At Best Buy.
Yeah, right. We don't want the riots at Best Buy. Exactly. So that's a problem. If everybody just wants to save their own house, then we have a worse outcome for everybody.
And let's just talk a little bit about Finland and Bulgaria and Poland, who were the first brunt of the Russian blockade of gas, let's say. But you and I talked earlier, that really wasn't that big of a deal because, for what you said, that they don't have a heavy reliance on it. So it seems like Russia is taking they're picking fights with those who they know they can pick fights with, to send a message, versus cutting off Germany, which if they cut off Germany, there would be a real crisis, right?
Right. So Germany imports 66% of their natural gas, and that is really important because Germany depends on exporting manufactured goods, and that's a lot of it is chemicals. So the chemical sector depends highly on gas. So that's why the German government is kind of walking this soft strategy on not being too drastic in their response to Russia. And that's why they're careful or cautious about cutting back gas too quickly. But of course, they know they have to, but they're hiding from that truth.
Right. So let's talk about that energy reality that they're in right now. And the energy reality that they're in comes in contrast to what we've heard from the EU, many of the EU members, especially the developed EU members over the years about their climate commitments, right? And their climate commitments now seem to be clashing heavily with the energy reality that they face, with high prices and with limited amounts of gas and things like that. So where does that set up this discussion for us to get Brian and our other efforts in the LNG efforts for Cheniere and others into this game,
Yeah, so I think there's truth to it. There is a challenge keeping both targets at the same level, so energy security and climate security, basically seeing both at the same level. And in the end, one cannot have two targets with the same level of priority. But that's what they're trying to do, at least officially. So the goal is to cut emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, and then going to net zero by 2050. And the 55 by 2030 target is, of course, it's very ambitious. And right now, they're trying to see if they can maintain this despite cutting back the gas from Russia, replacing some of it with diversifying imports, including from the US, including LNG, including also later hydrogen, green hydrogen, or what they call blue hydrogen, so with CCS. Right. And also, and that's something less talked about, they also want to extend the runtime of coal plants, so delay the phase out of coal plants. And on the other hand, they also want to keep some nuclear plants online longer.
And let's talk about one other piece of that, which is if we start sending gas to Europe, well, we were supposed to send that gas to Asia, right? So that just leaves Asia in kind of a lurch as well. And so we've got to be mindful, I think, of some of that, where some of our allies are just as strong on the other side of the ocean, right?
Right. And when I said about driving up the price, that's of course bad for Europe, but it's a rich people's problem there. When we talk about other places, I mean, this trickles down, right? This drives up the price for all energy commodities. And so in the end, the weakest suffer the most. And they will actually turn away from what we call the West if they don't see support in this situation, because they're under debt pressure, they're still suffering from the COVID crisis, they have a food crisis looming, and now they have the energy crisis.
And you're thinking specifically of Africa and India, some of these powerhouses, and we see that in India not really rejecting strongly what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, right? Because they see potential ally building opportunities there, very much the way China had done in the past. So let's bring this down to the level of the effort of what we can do, what we are doing already. And I'll just start this and then hand it over to you guys. To me, what we're seeing in the LNG market here is just fascinating, right? We've got an administration who's almost had their hand forced into more permits, and as many permits as they can get out the door. Cheniere has tons of gas going out from Corpus and from Sabine Pass. We were just down there with the Washington Post reporter and a bunch of European journalists a couple weeks ago. They're very interested in that story and how it's going to translate out too. You've got Sempra, who yesterday or 2 days ago announced another deal with RWE, the German utility, to send them lots of gas. And that's on top of a Polish agreement with the Polish national gas company that was earlier this month. And then, of course, we have new facilities that were announced yesterday from Global Ventures, which will double their output opportunity through the Plaquemines Parish facility. So we see on the infrastructure side, even with some resistance from the administration or having their hand forced into it, we're seeing this willingness to get that gas out the door and try and find new ways to get that gas out the door, even though we're kind of capped on it right now. So I think there's a lot to do and see there with this export activity that's kind of been generated. But bring it down to the RNG level and the landfill gas level and how that can play into the same type of environment and substitute the fossil gas piece for some of these. I mean, I know we're talking about this with the hydrogen facility here, right? It's using SMRs, and the only reason it's using SMRs is because of the water issues here in Vegas, right? Because a PEM electrolyzer has huge amount of water use, and when you're in Quebec and you have tons of hydro, that's easy, right? But here in Las Vegas, you don't have that. So, but what that means is to make it renewable, you have to get the landfill gas or the biodigesters from the area to use that. And so talk about how that that gives us the opportunity for green hydrogen or to green this this fossil gas LNG opportunity.
Yeah, I would just say there the first piece is when folks are thinking about expanding LNG capacity or expanding into Europe. Ultimately, everyone wants to have the same goals of saying, like, how are we going to think about this in a decarbonized way longer term, right? So there's always pushback. The one argument is you're displacing coal, which is a good thing. I mean, if you think about the last 12 months, coal is selling at record prices, record volumes, being exported, and we're solving the energy scarcity issue right now with coal. So just switching from coal to natural gas is a big win. But when folks think about decarbonization all the way to a net zero approach as we get to 2050, the LNG assets you build to expand have a life that goes beyond that. And so folks are saying, how are you actually going to be able to meet those goals when you're going to be basically adding more fossil usage, more fossil demand, and the point when you're going to need to be in this decarbonized mode? And that's where RNG comes in, because RNG is chemically identical to natural gas, and either through book or claim or actually through transporting it to wherever it would be entering a ship. You have the ability through the title transfer to move that renewable natural gas from a waste source, digester, wastewater, landfill, and through the natural gas network that's already been established. We've already spent trillions of dollars on to establish in North America, and we could leverage that in order to help decarbonize with what we're doing as we send RNG via book and claim, or putting those molecules directly on the ship that eventually will be delivered to the new partners under these contracts.
And Brian, on the local level, Sievers, on the local level, what does that mean? I mean, obviously farmers have been the beneficiary of lots of opportunities with wind and with solar, and now with these things. Talk about how that turns into opportunities beyond the borders of Iowa, beyond the Midwest, and how it creates a kind of a roadmap for how it can be done at Smithfield or at Pixley or wherever else, and then how that turns into just translating it into use in the global system.
So let's break it down. And Patrick, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think currently we have about 250 working anaerobic digesters on farms. In 317, thank you. We've done the research in years past. There's a potential for about 9,000. That's a huge potential. And that's just based on waste streams. Manure, dairy, and swine. There's more beef cattle in this country than there are dairy cattle. And by the way, beef cattle manure is an awesome feedstock for digesters. I won't get into the chemistry and the science as to why, but it is, trust me. So when you break it down that way, the potential is huge. Now you add in what we're doing with our digesters. We convert to a renewable natural gas production, and that's utilize biomass, energy crops that we grow like they do in Europe. There's 9,000 plants in Germany alone that utilize similar models where they're using energy crops, corn silage, maybe wheat leach, rye leach to feed their digesters. So they're at 9,000. I'll give you an example. In Iowa, which has a land mass, let's just say roughly equal to 2/3 the size of Germany, I believe. They have 9,000 in Germany. We have 3 currently in Iowa. Now we have, 9 under construction. So we're going to go from 3 to 12, probably by the end. We still have 8,000 and some left potential there just in Iowa. We have 24 million hogs. Why hasn't that been developed? Well, I won't get into that either, but it really has to come down to the utilization of the low carbon fuel standard, the scoring of the manure, Lagoon-style manure storage scores well under the LCFS program. In Iowa, we have pits under our hog barns. That doesn't score as well. So that's not low-hanging fruit for the swine industry digester program, but it will be very soon, we believe. We're working as an organization, as the ABC. And by the way, I forgot to mention, I serve on the board. I'm on the executive committee and also serve as chair of an ag committee with Natalie Hoffman. By the way, thank you, Natalie, for putting this panel together, and Patrick, of course. And if in our ag committee, we're focusing on how can we look for new pathways to help expand this industry, because the capacity is tremendous. So that 9,000 just in swine and dairy and waste streams, let's say it includes food waste as well. When you add biomass, it's probably 90,000. We don't know. We haven't done that research yet. I think we probably will very soon in the next 6 to 12 months. But the capacity to expand our industry is tremendous. Now, we've got our work cut out for us. We have a lot of detractors, too, from what we do. But we think we can continue to address those issues that are raised. In our science and research subcommittee, for example, under the Ag Committee, we've developed a list already of 21 issues that the anaerobic digestion industry, livestock primarily, industry has, and how are we going to address those? And we're starting to work on each of those 21 issues that the public or people have with the anaerobic digestion industry. So if we start to address some of those concerns that are raised, we think that'll clear an even easier pathway for us to expand the industry.
And that translates regionally, right? I mean,
Yes,
like what you're
absolutely.
doing in Iowa,
That's just one state.
what you're doing in Iowa can work in dairy farms in California or Vermont, or hog farms in North Carolina or Missouri, right? So,
Absolutely.
so it's setting the table, it's giving an example, it's creating the roadmap for you, which then creates the national network, right? Which can plug into the pipeline infrastructure, and it makes our current pipeline infrastructure, which we know environmentalists say is a wasted asset, right? It creates that opportunity for us to make that pipeline infrastructure more renewable, and gives us an opportunity to make it the part of the net zero solution, right?
And that's the point there, is that with this conference, 3 years ago, I'm not sure we had a pipeline utility that participated in our conference 3 years ago, maybe one or two. We have a number of pipeline utility companies that are very interested in attending this conference this year. So the interest in all sectors that will help assist and facilitate the development of an AD industry in the United States. We also have an administration and a Secretary of Agriculture that are very supportive of what we want to do. We want to help provide them a roadmap. We've got some things we're working on right now with some RFI requests for a new $500 million grant program for fertilizer. And those conditions in that USDA grant program are that it be sustainable, US based, farmer friendly. There's 3 or 4 more. Every one of the criteria that are listed in that $500 million grant programs, when you go, those are anaerobic digesters we're talking about.
Go ahead, Max, jump in.
Yeah, and I just want to come in because that links directly to what was going through my mind when we talk about the potential for RNG or liquefied RNG to Europe. Europe wants to cut gas demand by 80%, 80% by 2030. So it's just in 8 years. Of course, it's a plan for now. So we'll say it's a plan. Maybe they won't hit it, but it's an ambitious plan. And out of this remaining 20%, a third is supposed to be biomethane. So that's, of course, substantial. The number wouldn't be that much, of course, if they wouldn't cut the gas demand that much. So they come from two ends, right? And then they say the same thing, sustainable biomethane, and they see also the bridge to the nutrient cycle. And I think that's where it limits. There's no interest, or at least on paper, in importing biomethane as opposed for the LNG or the hydrogen, because the biomethane is so promising locally if you have the double benefit. Because Europe also imports between 60 or 80 to 30% of fertilizers, depending what fertilizer we're talking about. So it's huge. And of course, it's the same countries, right? So we import a lot of mineral fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine. So here we go again. It's the same, it's hitting you again. So bringing this all into the circular, localized economy, that doesn't mean there is not a potential, Brian. I'm just saying what they have on paper right now. So this is an interesting thing. The other big point I want to bring in is just the LNG hunger they have right now. Is a very short-term thing. They want it now. They want it this year and the next few years, and they're committed to buying up to 2030. But trust me, it's going to go down significantly, the demand from Europe, at least. I can't speak for Asia. Asia will remain a buyer. So export facilities here will become, of course, more reliant on Asia, but building new infrastructure in Europe doesn't make sense economically. So we will not have a lot of potential there.
So let's get you in here, Brian McCarthy, on the pieces that you're moving around the chessboard and how they play into this national effort that becomes an international effort, right? Because we talked about how dairy farms and cattle and biodigesters in agriculture can play this national role. But talk about how landfills can play that national role too, because there are landfills everywhere.
Yeah, there's landfills everywhere, and it's not just in the United States. I mean, as you look at, especially Ukraine and East, there's a significant amount of landfills and a lot of landfill gas that's produced there that also could be harnessed. So this is not just about the United States, but it's an international opportunity. The second piece is that it's predictable. So one of the things we love about our business is that even if you assumed waste did not enter landfills anymore, like you're going to have this predictable amount of gas that's going to be produced, and it also, with that visibility, it allows you to enter into contracts under a long-term basis that you're going to have this feedstock that's reliable that'll be able to meet. And the last piece is that from a scalability perspective, landfills produce a lot of gas. And so one project can have a big impact on the amount of RNG that's produced. And so as you think about the ability to continue to scale large projects, huge quantities of RNG, then all of a sudden that becomes compelling when you're trying to decarbonize a cargo, for example. When you have these contracts, you can talk about volumes that are meaningful to the problem at hand.
And Brian started to get into this with Secretary of Agriculture, and certainly we've seen a very aggressive salesman type Secretary of Energy who is very energetic. And we had her out here at the Nevada hydrogen plant with Senator Cortez Masto. She came to our LaPorte plant. She's been in NREL. She's been all over, right? But let's talk about some of the policy drivers, not just federally, but in your case, Brian, probably locally too, right? Where they're creating opportunities across the board. So some of those policy drivers, and Max, you can get into this too from a federal level. Let's talk about some of the policy drivers that we see as an absolute necessity for us to move this from where we currently are, which is very promising, to an actual reality that it is happening, right? That's what I like to say about the hydrogen plant, right? Hydrogen is now, it's happening, right? And you see it in the mobility market in California. You see it with forklifts. You see it with LADWP, converting power plants, right? So it's happening, right? And I think that I want to see how, what does it mean? What does it take? What are the policy drivers to make this go from where it's almost happening to where it is happening?
So my perspective and that of the ABC as well is it's an all of the above. So it's landfill gas, it's food waste, it's livestock manure, potentially biomass, all of those potential feedstocks to produce renewable natural gas or biogas have to be incentivized, developed, and grown. What we as an association, and this is still a work in progress, but I think you'll probably see something coming from the ABC here very soon. We think that at a state level, we're going to see some policy development processes that are going to occur. Let's say, for example, New Mexico, maybe Nebraska, Minnesota, maybe New York. If we focus on those states where there might be an opportunity to pass an LCFS, that's where we're going to direct, I think, this is my own personal belief, we should direct our resources as an organization. Let's get those passed. That'll help benefit those providers of renewable natural gas or biogas into the pipeline, if you will, or to the grid, so we can start to pick them off one state at a time. Now, I happen to be in a state of Iowa. It's going to be a while before we pass an LCFS. We have 43 ethanol plants in Iowa. They're very afraid of an LCFS because, and our governor, obviously, as well, yes, and 10 biodiesel plants. However, by the end of, probably by a year from now, we'll have at least 12 anaerobic digester plants. So actually our renewable natural gas or biogas production will probably exceed biodiesel production in the state of Iowa. No one has even thought about that process. And we're just barely even getting started as a state in developing an AD industry. So we've got a lot of potential for growth. We've got some state policy initiatives that we want to focus on through the development of LCFSs in those states. And once those states start passing, obviously like what California, Oregon, and Washington have, then I think you'll start to see other states get very interested. And eventually Iowa will have to come along.
Talk about the policy drivers at the local level for landfills, because we know landfills really are a local government opportunity where you really have to work hard there. So talk about how that works and how it translates up from a policy driver standpoint and what you're doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I think about the two things that might slow a project down for us, one is the interconnect and just being able to either get right of ways or get into the grid. And that's gotten a lot better even from when we started Archaea to where it is today. So that's the first piece. And that's part of the story. If we're going to move natural gas, we have to continue to make the interconnect process more smooth and quicker, cheaper. That's really important. And then the second thing is that when you talk about, especially at landfills, there's typically opposition groups you'll find in these areas around that. And
no way, really?
Yeah. Local zoning can become the biggest holdup for a project, even though when you look at all of the air quality benefits of what's happening, I mean, it's truly beneficial to the area. And so we have a group internally at Archaea just specifically focused on working to have local outreach for where our projects are going to be, because we already have plant operators typically in the area. If we have a landfill gas to electric, we already have folks on the ground that know what people care about. And so when we think about the culture at Archaea is very, very focused on operator focus. We always want to know like how, putting gas in the pipe or putting electrons in the grid is what our company does. And so if you think about the operators, they're on the ground, they know what matters. And so you're not a company that's just coming in, you've already got a presence. And so that's a big part of what we're doing. And we've seen that. So we bought a project in Kentucky that a developer was not able to finish, and we were able to take over that project, and we finished that project after about 4 months. We brought our gas processing team in, and we were able to interconnect that. And this is the first time the landfill owner said the opposition group actually reached out and said thank you that we were able to get this project. The odor violations are way down. The local communities behind the project, and now it's actually being able to accept more waste because you don't have the smells that are coming from that. So this is about an education process, but ultimately, if you want to connect the good you're doing at the local level, you have to work with local groups on the ground in order to make the global
Absolutely,
impact.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'm going to get back to Max here. I'm going to lead in a question on you though, because one of the UN food officials recently made some big news when he was speaking at a food sustainability conference, and he said that if we go off natural gas too fast, people are going to starve, right? And that has lots of implications, not just for for the power side. That has implications. He's talking about implications in other places. So let's finish the policy driver discussion, then get to people's questions. But let's finish the policy discussion with that UN official's comments and what that means to where we are and what it could be for an opportunity for RNG, LNG, and all the types of gas we're talking about here today.
Thank you. I mean, that's of course, that's a very important point, because what I mentioned with Europe, their plans for dealing with the current situation, they're really focused on Europe, and the most they care or they mention is the European neighborhood, meaning Central Eastern Europe, including, of course, Ukraine, very important, and then a little bit Northern Africa, a little bit the Middle East, mostly for the hydrogen question. But the big concern is, of course, you have to think globally. And a lot of people depend on fertilizer imports. A lot of people depend on, I mean, we've seen it in Sri Lanka, right? Where the government And I'm totally for organic agriculture, but basically overnight they banned mineral fertilizer. And that's the thing, I think, when you talk about too quick. I mean, that's, of course, that's not smart policy making. If you say from tomorrow, this is illegal, we'll eat whatever is left, and that's it. So that's not how you can do this. And of course, most people know and understand this, but unfortunately not enough. And now we've seen the unrest, and I've just seen a report somebody wrote, Sri Lanka being an omen of what's to come. I mean, I think that's I think that's wrong in two ways. For one, Sri Lanka is a country with people and not an omen. So it's not, we're actually talking about people's fate there and suffering. But then, of course, it doesn't have to be that way. I think it's not too late. We just have to be smart in the sense of, yes, we need a long-term perspective. And I imagine that's hopefully what the UN official also meant. And that's what I think is so great about some of the things in Europe are not great, don't get me wrong. But what I like there is they make longer term plans. So they have targets, interim targets, long-term targets, and they have a pathway. And that's good for private sector, for individuals, for municipalities to get their bearing, to know where the train is headed, and to be able to adjust the investment, to not have stranded assets, to not have misinvestments, to actually know what's the future, what's happening in 5 years, what's happening in 10 years. Then you can actually get everybody on board. And that's so important, because then you have a net win for everybody.
And you're talking about getting everybody on board in the larger national sense, just like Brian's talking about getting everybody on board in the local sense, right? So you're seeing a consistency, you're seeing a theme at how we make these projects work together across the board. So let's, we have about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure that we give you guys a chance to ask questions, because this has been really a great panel, I think, in terms we've covered a lot of ground. But maybe we haven't covered something exactly that you want us to take. So let's take questions from you guys. And I always tell my class that I teach at George Washington, I need to hear some questions. So let's get some questions. Go ahead, Natalie. Oh, yeah, take one. And then we'll pass them over.
Thank you. So the U.S. entered into this joint task force with the EU to supply all this additional LNG to Europe this year. I think it's 15 billion cubic meters more this year and 3 times as much by 2030. Okay, so putting aside the infrastructure issues that we have in Europe as well as here, what about, so Brian, if you're making RNG, either you probably don't sell it into California because of the carbon intensity, but maybe you sell to the voluntary market, you get RINs if it's used as a transportation fuel. What is the US government doing, if anything, to replace the incentives that people like Archaea would get if they used that RNG for transportation fuel here in the US, for example?
Yeah, I would say right now we're not seeing any specific benefits that are coming right now, specifically for if you think about like a renewable thermal credit or something like that, or you're using outside of transportation. Like I think that's still to come. One of the pieces is, if we think about exporting more natural gas, North America historically was the sink. All the natural gas would be imported, and we've turned our imports into export facilities and grown exports. But we've benefited from the shale revolution. We've had this lower natural gas price across the board. As we connect the world with more gas leaving, that means that as we experience oil on a global price here, we're going to start experiencing natural gas on a global price. And so one of the ramifications is just the CH4 price is going to go up. And we're already seeing at $9 right now on the front end of the curve. On a BTU basis, it's 6 to 1. So if we believe that, eventually that means that natural gas actually could go significantly higher. So one of the pieces is thinking about the renewable benefits if you sell through LNG or biomethanol, connecting them to what the EU might be offering in terms of benefits, so that benefit can flow to the project. But then second is, we're also have a view that natural gas pricing in the next 10 years is going up. And so when you think about the ability to lower costs of production at the at the landfill project, for example, then all of a sudden you have a higher your ROI is going to be driven a lot more by what that CH4 price is. Where even 3 years ago when you had $2 gas, you couldn't make an RNG project landfill work at $2.
Well, and that's an issue, right? That continues to be an issue, right? And the task force, we don't know what that really is going to be, right? No one knows. It's right now. It's a press release for the administration and for EU, right? So that's it has to be created, and that's where we have to play a role in creating it, right? And so I think the other thing is we've created natural opposition, right, from our industrial users, because they've been used to the $2-3 gas price, which is superficially low, right? They forget that 10 years ago, 13 years ago, before the shale revolution, we were paying $13 for gas, $15 for gas, right? So the industrial users group is now one of the biggest carpers about this export, and to me, that's kind of that America First approach on this in this environment with the challenges EU is facing and with the problems in Ukraine. It's almost it almost is unseemly that they would take that approach, right? Just because they're going to have to pay $7 for gas.
I'm going to, if I could, just look at a little bit different perspective on policy, both at the state and federal level. Through ABC, we do a lot of activity on trying to streamline some processes. For example, D3 and D5 RINs for renewable natural gas. Right now, our beef cattle manure, and we co-digest with industrial food waste, that would not be eligible for the higher D3 RIN. So now we're going to have to separate it. Because why? Because the EPA says we can't allow you to do that and still receive the D3 RIN. So we'll have to create a separate digester for our food waste. So that's several $1 million of additional investment. It's frustrating. We can manage and monitor and measure those things if we were allowed to co-digest, but the regulatory authority won't let us do it. So we'll play by their rules. We understand. But that's one frustration we as developers face each and every day. Now let's look at the state level. So in Iowa, Lisa, are you listening? Because this is where you know about this one. So in Iowa, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources has an Iowa Waste Exchange. They are doing an excellent job of finding waste resources and lining those up with users like us, anaerobic digesters, who will take these waste streams from industrial food waste processors. They do a great job, and they literally call me, about every other week saying, hey, I've got a co-feed here you might want to look at. Let's take a look at it. So now we just submitted a permit application for our new lagoon-style digester through the DNR. They come back with 4 new conditions for the permit. One of the 4 said, you shall not take any outside waste for your digester. It shall only process beef cattle manure. And basically I said, what? You've been allowing us to do this since 2013. And then they did come back and say, well, that was a mistake. But the new digesters that are being built in Iowa have that condition. It's only going to be dairy manure. And first of all, there's 2 issues. First of all, they don't have the authority under Iowa law to do that, but yet they're still going to impose these conditions by the same agency on the other end who's trying to incentivize the use of these waste co-feeds in digesters like ours. They need to get on the same page. Come on, folks.
We get those mixed signals all the time. You see it in the oil market. You see it in the gas market. You see it on infrastructure issues with this administration. But here, let me give this. You give that to those guys, and I'll give you this one because I know you want to contribute to that last conversation.
Yeah. First, to the question of EU benefits going to possible RNG imports. It's an interesting point because that's actually something that is technically already somewhat open, because there was a mention in the Repower EU plan, which is this most recent plan, about extending these benefits that are currently only possible to extend to non-EU providers for electricity to other fuels as well. It's very vague at this point. Nobody mentions biomethane there or RNG explicitly, but at least the door is that open. So I think if you lean against that door, I think there is a starting moment to realize that the benefits you know, if it's good for the climate and if it's good for energy security, then it shouldn't be a barrier against it. Just on that end. And I think here, I think a very important US perspective is also, if we don't think there's a lot happening maybe in legislature, maybe there will be still legislation passed. I'm not saying not, but it's maybe a 50-50 thing. But the US federal government is also, it's the biggest buyer in the world. Their budget is 650 billion per year. So that's also what can create markets and can drive markets. And I think we should think about how we can pressure this. There's a whole Buy Clean initiative that doesn't focus so much on biogas and biomethane. So this is something we could think about.
So we have a question in the back. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. From where I'm at,
And who are you and who are you with?
Ricardo Moreno with Sempra Energy.
Thank you.
From where I'm understanding right now, there is not a higher incentive in going through the whole process of getting the RNG, liquefying it, shipping it to Europe, and selling it there, compared to the benefits or the incentives that you have as an RNG producer here in the US, selling it through the LCFS or RIN, getting the RINs or all that. Is that the case? Am I understanding well? And your vision is that at some point it will be economically feasible and better to go through all this process of paying one of these liquefaction companies the cost of liquefying it, the shipping companies the cost of shipping it, and selling it there instead of here?
Yeah, I mean, right now that there's not a specific credit that you could use to put into Europe. That's correct. But the one thing I would just say is, from like a long-term offtake perspective, what you're seeing with utilities, for example, in the United States and Canada, they're saying you must decarbonize. You are a natural gas utility. The only way you can decarbonize is to come up with a renewable fuel in your grid. It's an existential crisis. And so it's RNG or hydrogen in order to do that. That same thing is going to happen from, even that 20%, if that's the number that's going to be of natural gas as we look towards 2030, that needs to be decarbonized as well. And so ultimately, I think it actually will start. I think eventually there will be a credit program. I do think that's where it'll go. But in the short run, long-term offtake partners, utilities in Europe that are responding to that same existential threat, and now they have a second threat actually of scarcity. But in terms of decarbonization, they're looking to enter into long-term fixed price arrangements, and those prices are lower than what you might get in a D3 RIN today. But the flip side is you have years of visibility, and you typically have a very good credit that they're already going to be paying all the costs of transport. They're already going to be paying all the costs of liquefaction. So you're actually just talking about attribute value that needs to be transacted. And so that's the market. That's where Archaea spends its time, is we're trying to think about what's that next long-term fixed price market that we can continue to build out, and that they're going to respond to the exact same incentives that they would, you'd find in the United States or Canada.
Just to add to this, that currently the regulatory regime in Europe is not quite there yet. I mean, the UK is further along, but unfortunately they left the EU, and the Dutch are the next in line in terms of being closer to it, but there's no coherent framework for actually enabling this. So this is all still a construction site, but definitely I agree with you that the future, if you see net zero somewhere, of course you could just have offsetting projects, etc. But it makes much more sense, especially if it's economically viable. And if we see a higher fossil future, a higher fossil price future anyway, then the gap will be very small or even no gap at all. So I think that's where we're headed, definitely.
We have a question right here. Go ahead.
Hi, Doug from Hart Bioenergy. Quick question about, I guess, specifically to you, Max, about how Germany dealt with early on in the biogas industry as it was building up there, or similar kind of where we're at today here. The conversation around security, environmental and social benefit, what were the biggest challenges there? And how did you overcome that?
I'm sorry, I don't know. So the beginning was energy security and the link to energy security, social aspects, and climate, basically.
Yeah, those different kind
Yeah.
of conversations around
Yeah.
that as the industry built up. What were the barriers and what helped to overcome that?
For the biogas industry in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's, of course, the incentive regimes are very different from member state to member state in Europe. So you can see this also in how far this has been successful, like in Denmark or Germany, or not so successful in other member states. So there's a lot of potential that's not used yet in Europe as well. That's where they want to build up their total of 35 billion cubic meters of biomethane in addition to what's there right now. And I think the EU is just discovering this as an important pathway, but of course we had EU-wide renewable quotas, both for renewable energy overall and then renewable fuel quotas. And these were, of course, drivers for what you said. So there's like a requirement for member states to fulfill. These are not utility requirements, but member state requirements in Europe. But they then drove the development within Europe for renewables across all sectors, including in biogas and other biofuels. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, right? So I know you have mics. Go ahead.
My name is Brandon Barney. I'm with Public Radio in Southern California. Most gasoline in the US has an ethanol blend, and I was wondering from the gentleman from Archaea, perhaps, what would be an ambitious RNG blend for US natural gas that would achieve many of these strategic goals?
Yeah, I think when I look at the North American natural gas market, it's about 100 billion cubic feet a day. It's huge. And I think we're about 20 BCF a day is going out via LNG. I think that when we look at all the different sources, digesters, wastewater, landfill, biomass, you look at a market that can approach 7 to 10 BCF a day. I mean, I think we have a significant amount of growth ahead of us. And so when I look at, especially in California, for example, what they're coming out with, both with 1383 gas and also trying to continue to decarbonize what they're doing, which is almost, the BCF a day of demand, that's a significant amount of volumes above where the RNG market is. So one of the things when I look at the supply and demand dynamic today, that's what gets us going, is that we need to produce a lot of RNG. And so ultimately I see that, as natural gas demand either stays flat or we have more of it exporting and maybe it comes down over time, I see that ability for RNG to continue to grow into the double-digit percentages for natural gas production in North America.
Well, I want to thank all you guys for an informative and really great panel that covered a lot of ground. And I think we did a lot of different things and we covered a lot of different things. And I just appreciate you guys tuning in, and I appreciate those online tuning in. And I look forward to doing this again sometime with you. So thank you so much for having us, and thanks for a great panel.
And thank you everyone for coming to Biogas Americas this week. There will be other ABC events. We've got our operator training in Wisconsin in August. We've got Biogas Americas RNG, which will be a virtual event, but all focused on RNG in October. And we will be in Chicago, May 15 to 18 next year. Thank you everyone for coming.